In this presentation, we're going to explore the leadership virtue of vulnerability. Leaders who demonstrate vulnerability are open emotionally and are willing to apologize when they are wrong. Vulnerability, when it's done well, can build connections and foster solidarity. Throughout this semester, as you view the prerequisite PowerPoints and as you actually explore the articles that you will read as prerequisites, I think it would be a really good idea to keep maybe a notebook where you can jot down your notes as you read the article and as you explore the PowerPoints, listen to the presentation, because I think these notes will really help you in terms of digging deeper into both of these types of items, as well as will help you to have a rich conversation when we start talking about them in the next class meetings. So for now, with this PowerPoint, I would like you to pause and in your notebook, reflect and write about the questions that you see on this slide. I suspect that many of you may have already seen the TED Talk entitled The Power of Vulnerability that was given by Dr. Brene Brown back in June of 2010. To date, that video has had well over 50 million views. And if you've ever experienced that groundbreaking talk or you'd like to revisit it, I have placed a link to that at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. But for our purposes in this presentation, I would like you to pause now and click on the link on this slide and watch a short Brene Brown video that's entitled Embracing Vulnerability. One way to define vulnerability is really that it is about accepting uncertainty and risk and emotional exposure. It's about allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, and that's critical to facing failure and being able to learn from it. Vulnerability requires that we be open and willing to risk emotional exposure, and while vulnerability can be considered a weakness in certain circumstances, it is certainly considered a strength in relationships. We are all vulnerable when we approach a new situation and face a potential failure. Starting a master's program, beginning a new course, embarking on an internship, starting a new job. All examples of where we really feel nervous and possibly even as though we are imposters. When starting a new job, we may feel excited, but we also feel a bit uncertain about the expectations and even our own ability to do well. Perhaps, like I did a few times in my career, you may be taking a risk in the near future by changing roles. The new responsibilities may feel like a stretch. In a new job, you may face emotional exposure when you're trying to build relationships with new coworkers and revealing what you don't know as you ask questions. Most of us approach every role with vulnerability. If we don't, we might even be perceived as a know-it-all. So in a new role, vulnerability can actually be a good strength, a willingness to expose our weaknesses in order to form relationships and to learn. We are vulnerable when we fail, and each of us inevitably will fail. We feel rejected when, for example, new coworkers might exclude us or go to lunch without inviting us. We tend to be frustrated when we struggle to complete an assignment. We get embarrassed when we make mistakes. But we need to face these types of setbacks rather than denying them. Instead of spiraling into shame, we need to reach out and talk about whatever is troubling us. We need to take risks and demonstrate vulnerability in an effort to form connections. In our line of work, it really is all about relationships. But in some other disciplines, vulnerability can be considered a weakness. For instance, if you're working in computing, vulnerable data can be accessed and manipulated by hackers. In video games, which many of you may play with, invulnerability means being impervious or protected. When we think of people who are vulnerable, we may get images of people needing help or protection. I think the way I have to carefully describe my research proposals to express and address whether I'm involving vulnerable populations, people who might be manipulated or exploited. On the other hand, though, if we allow ourselves to be vulnerable in relationships with others, to be open, to face fear, to face possible rejection, vulnerability becomes more of a strength than a weakness. As leaders, and as future leaders, we have a choice as to how we want to be viewed, how we want to present ourselves to others, how we respond to feedback. We can choose openness, or we can choose to protect ourselves. As Brene Brown notes in this quote, protection can be tempting. Thought leader Amy Newman suggests that leaders who cannot be vulnerable tend to isolate themselves from others, and thus they put their organization at risk. Perhaps because they don't feel worthy or good enough, which is actually a shame. They choose to hide mistakes and avoid asking for help. Oftentimes, if leaders had admitted their failures, they could have limited the damage. Leaders sometimes overcompensate for feeling inadequate by wearing a mask of confidence or bravado. Good leaders are not perfect, and no one really expects them to be. But leaders who feel under pressure may wear a mask, so to speak, to be one who appears perfect. Unfortunately, that type of facade actually pushes people away. Being overly guarded may actually put leaders at most risk and put them in a position of having the most to lose. It would seem then the better, the more difficult choice is choosing connection, admitting failure, asking for help, admitting and showing what we don't know. When we are vulnerable, we are not afraid to offer a suggestion or present an idea, potentially looking foolish. We are better able to take criticism without falling apart, which leads us to being able to work with others to solve problems and create something new, perhaps even innovative. Leaders need to allow others to be vulnerable as well. When someone shares something personal, they are being vulnerable with you, and it can be confusing as to how to respond. One option might be to build connections, is that you need to be vulnerable yourself, admitting your own failings, and sometimes that puts others at ease and allows for honest conversations. However, that being said, vulnerability does not mean we neglect the important act of setting boundaries. Author David Brooks, who wrote The Road to Character and The Second Mountain, noted that to be healed is to be broken open. Amy Newman and Brene Brown suggest that we live wholehearted lives when we are willing to be vulnerable. Leaders don't need to be fearless, but leaders do need to be open to imperfection. Vulnerability can be a difficult choice. It means we're facing our shortcomings in order to build connections and remain whole. Once again, I'm going to ask you to pause, reflect, and write in your notebook. Please address the questions that are on this screen. Again, these notes will be invaluable when we get together in our next face-to-face class meeting and you share your thoughts from your notebook. On April 23rd of 2019, self-help expert Brene Brown, who has spent her career researching courage, shame, and worthiness, joined the Today Show to talk about her new Netflix special at the time, entitled The Call to Courage, and why really people need to lean into their vulnerability. I would ask you to pause here, click on the link on this page, and take a time and watch this interesting interview. In addition to avoiding vulnerabilities, leaders may also experience pressure from above not to apologize. In his book, Crisis Communications, thought leader Stephen Fink suggests that lawyers are particularly to blame for institutions' reluctance to be more human. As it should be, attorneys for business, education, and medical institutions are primarily concerned with litigation, and that message, what you say can be held against you, rings true. But it is important to consider that all of this matters in terms of public opinion. When we're talking about the media, the community, and social media, trolls will stand in judgment of what you say and what you don't say. It is possible that lawyers may be overly cautious when they advise against saying much at all. Particularly in our area of public service, our stakeholders do need to hear from leaders, particularly in cases of crisis or wrongdoing. As you can imagine, responding with no comment or blaming others can lead to even more criticism. Think about examples of the value of apologizing. You might want to jot those down in your notebook. Author and thought leader Stephen Fink noted that in his 30-plus years of experience, he's never seen a single instance when not saying "we are sorry" staved off any litigation. He suggests that his clients apologize when it is appropriate and to let emotions show if needed. In other words, demonstrate you have a heart. Fink also stresses the value of telling the truth and doing so early for two particular reasons. First of all, an apology gives leaders peace of mind and clear-headedness to face a situation head-on. He says, take your lumps early and get it over with. Second, he posits that an apology helps to rebuild the leader's reputation and the institution's reputation. Although it is difficult to support with research, many thought leaders believe that an apology is good for the soul and good for building relationships. Although lawyers are concerned that apologies have the potential to fuel lawsuits, research actually shows that apologies have the opposite effect. Apologies actually reduce lawsuits, and the medical community is catching on to this information. A number of medical institutions are placing full disclosure of medical errors as statements on their websites. For example, you will find these on the University of Michigan Health System, the Stanford University Medical Center, and the University of Illinois Medical Center. This new approach has actually resulted in fewer pre-suit claims and lawsuits, and when people have sued, there have been less severe claims, faster settlements, which resulted in reduced legal fees and lower malpractice premiums. Similar to the experiences of a medical practitioner, corporate business leaders are beginning to understand the value of an apology as well. It appears that public perception of apologies has shifted from a sign of weakness to one of strength. But be forewarned, apologies must be sincere, ideally demonstrating a level of vulnerability, which means they are usually rather painful, and asking deep probing questions will be part of the game, such as, how did we get here? How did we drift from the institution we aspire to be? Or how did I get here? How did I drift from the person I aspire to be? It's important to remember that a sincere apology means that similar mistakes are not going to be made in the future. Another important thing to keep in mind here is that apologies express guilt, but they are not about shame. Brene Brown tells us that guilt is, I am sorry I made a mistake. Shame is, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. Amy Newman tells us that admitting a mistake is adaptive. Feeling shame, on the other hand, is damaging and often correlates with such things as addiction, depression, eating disorders, violence, etc. One example that thought leader Amy Newman offers as an example of vulnerability and a meaningful apology is from the editor of the Rolling Stones magazine. When that magazine published an article entitled "A Rape on Campus" about the University of Virginia, the editors probably felt they were doing a service to benefit their readers. If you recall, the article reported a rape in a fraternity and blamed the administration for not doing enough to address sexual assault on campus. However, the scathing article was not actually well researched. When the reporter tried to protect the victim, important facts did not line up, and a number of people were unfairly accused. In fact, in subsequent litigation, the reporter and Rolling Stone were found guilty of defaming the UVA associate dean. Now, to their credit, Rolling Stone faced their failings even before the lawsuits. They asked the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism to conduct an external review and promised to publish results, which turned out to be quite damning. In a 13,000-word report, researchers concluded that the story, A Rape on Campus, is a story of journalistic failure that was avoidable. The actual report can still be found on the Rolling Stones website, along with a note from the editor, that really clearly demonstrates vulnerability. Here he laid bare their flaws and acknowledged the pain that they caused. This is a unique and particularly interesting situation. Undeniably, rape is underreported, and often because victims feel shame. Rolling Stone intended to give voice to those who are unable to speak for themselves. Yet, as the editor notes, they fell far short of that intent. Once again, I'm going to ask you to click on the link on this slide, and it'll take you to an article that was written in January 18th of 2021. As you look through this newsletter from Character Lab, it would be a good idea to jot down some notes for our conversation at our next class meeting. Perhaps it's safe to say that nowhere do leaders feel more vulnerable than on social media. Do you remember an instance when the United Airlines denied boarding to two teenagers for wearing leggings? A passenger overheard the conversation, and you probably know the rest. Twitter users responded quickly with over 175,000 mentions about this incident, and I think those went up daily. But what people did not realize is that these particular girls were traveling free as relatives of a United employee. When the airlines offers these types of free tickets, they have a dress code because these travelers are considered representatives of the company. While you and I might disagree with the policy, the public reaction was disproportionate to the actual truth of the situation. Perhaps a good example of how social media can invite hasty and uninformed reactions. Unfortunately, many are of the opinion that mean words on the internet don't hurt anyone, and as educators and leaders we know that's simply not true. Bullying, harassment, hate speech, and otherwise tormenting online behaviors have been directly linked to suicide attempts. Recently, a study of 2,000 middle school students found that those who had been cyberbullied were twice as likely to attempt suicide as students who had not experienced cyberbullying. Many leaders understandably avoid social media. 61% of Fortune Global 500 leaders have no media presence. It might be said they're missing out on an opportunity to connect with their customers because they see social networking as a distraction or even a potential danger. Perhaps they fear emotional exposure, and we all know that fear is real. Thought leader Amy Newman, however, asks the question, which is worse, hiding from conversations or engaging in them? It would seem that leaders really cannot hide from public scrutiny. This took place long before the onset of social media. It is possible that hiding from the social media mob has the potential to even fuel its fury, a challenging dilemma for sure. However, if we believe that leaders do best by admitting failures and engaging detractors, instead of ignoring or trying to squelch them, then perhaps it's best to stay in the conversation and be vulnerable. What do you think? Do you think school leaders should have a social media presence? Jot your thoughts down in your notebook. Brene Brown talks about the 6 myths of vulnerability. First of all, she attacks the one that says vulnerability is a weakness. And she has repeatedly stated, both in videos and in her books, that she cannot come up with a single example of courage without also vulnerability being attached. The second myth she addresses is I don't do vulnerability. Her response is that pretending that we don't do vulnerability means letting the fear drive out our thinking and our behavior. And almost always, it leads to either acting out or shutting down. The third myth, I can go it alone. Well, she says needing no one pushes against everything we know about human neurobiology. We are actually hardwired for connection. We are a social species. You can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. Well, those in fields in which systemic is equated with failure, these are the ones are often ones in which people struggle most for daring leadership skills. If you don't do vulnerability or you have a culture that thinks vulnerability is a weakness, then ethical decision making actually is a problem. Number 5, trust comes before vulnerability. Well, she calls this kind of a catch-22. We need to trust to be vulnerable, and we need to be vulnerable in order to build trust. Vulnerability is disclosure is the final myth that she discusses. Now, Brene is not a proponent of oversharing. Indiscriminate disclosure or vulnerability for vulnerability's sake are not what she's recommending. However, she does not believe one can be a daring leader without some level of vulnerability. The current writings of many thought leaders suggest that vulnerability in leadership is a strength. By being vulnerable, we open up ourselves to connection with others. We admit mistakes and weaknesses to avoid shame and allow others to know and support us. Many thought leaders believe that by demonstrating vulnerability, we gain power and remove it from our critics. Brene Brown offers this particular definition of a leader. I've come to believe that a leader is anyone who holds him or herself accountable for finding potential in people and processes. The term leader has nothing to do with position, status, or the number of direct reports, but it is for anyone who is willing to dare greatly and lead. We'll conclude this particular presentation with the thoughts that you see on this slide, and I would invite you to think again now about how would you define a leader? Think about what a leader is. What are the qualities? What are the virtues? What are the strengths? Connect these kinds of things as we move forward to past experiences and hopefully to future experiences in this course. I look forward to hearing about the thoughts you've put in your journal as you have explored this particular presentation.